Welcome to Chapter 10 of Integrated Activism. This is the 10th in our series of chapters about the book Integrated Activism, published by myself, Alexis Ziegler. This chapter is about addressing the root causes of our ecological crisis. So since the 1950s, the number of people who assert that they are happy in response to sociological studies has remained essentially unchanged in spite of huge increases in consumption. So the number of residential square footage per person has increased about 3 times since the 1950s, threefold. The number of commercial space has increased, the amount of commercial space has increased about tenfold per capita since the 1950s. Overall, our consumption has skyrocketed upwards, and yet our level of happiness has not, at least in the United States. Now, this whole process of consuming more and more and more, in spite of the fact it's not making us happy, most environmental books in the first couple of pages say, oh, humans are greedy and they breed too much. It's just human nature, quote unquote. It's amazing how many people buy into that human nature thing. And, we breed too much, we consume too much, we're greedy, that's just who we are. Well, there's no anthropological basis for that, to start with. It becomes this question of population versus consumption. Is it the population of the underdeveloped world that's causing the environmental crisis? Or is it the consumption of the developed world, the industrialized world, that's causing the environmental crisis? I think it's simply two sides of the same coin. You have certainly great increases in human population growth in the last centuries, but interestingly enough, in recent decades, meat consumption has been growing twice as fast as population. And meat is an environmentally expensive product. So it's really two sides of the same coin. It's growth, 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 growth at all price costs, growth at the cost of the future. Now, the traditional theory that describes or pretends to explain the growth of human population and ultimately the growth of consumption is called the demographic transition theory. And this is a graph of the demographic transition theory. What happens is, over here on the left side, we have, back in the Dark Ages, when population was low because there was a high death rate and a high birth rate, and as industrialism comes along and the death rate declines, the birth rate holds on for a while, but it eventually falls off. This is what has happened in the industrial countries. The problem with this is it is a self-congratulatory and historically uninformed, anthropologically uninformed, and quite bigoted theory. It's interesting because some very respected environmental groups or environmental publications continue to refer to demographic transition theory, even though it's an incredibly uninformed and bigoted theory. WorldWatch is the one that comes to mind from the WorldWatch Institute. They've published stuff about the demographic transition theory for many, many years, up until the 2000s, certainly. I don't know if they still quote it or not. But certainly for the last century, there has been an abundance of information to contradict the demographic transition theory. Going back to 1922, Alexander Carson Saunders, he published a big fat book, which is actually at the University of Virginia. Even they've got some old books there. Not everything new and nifty on YouTube is important. Some things dating back a century or more might be important too. Think about that. So, Sir Alexander Saunders published this thing in 1922. What he did was he looked at all of the anthropological evidence he could find, hundreds and hundreds of books about ethnographies from all over the world, and naturally there's been many produced since then, and he tried to look at human population limiting practices. And here's a quote from him. "In all parts of the world there existed among primitive races, before they had been subjected to European or other outside influence, customs the primary function of which was the restriction of increase. It is submitted that the evidence does show customs restrictive to increase to have been so widespread in the form of either abortion, infanticide, or prolonged abstinence from intercourse, so as to have been practically universal." So that's 1922. This, oh my gosh, shocking insight that humans, pre-industrial humans at least, all of them, practically universal, engaged in strong population-limiting behaviors, or that's what they did. So let's go to 1993. Marvin Harris. "Contrary to the Malthusian view, much evidence supports the conclusion that pre-industrial cultures regulated the size of their families as to minimize the cost and maximize the benefits of reproduction." Okay, that's 1993. In 1967, a study by George Devereaux of 350 pre-industrial cultures found that abortion was an absolutely universal phenomenon. So we have all of this information going back at least a century, that pre-industrial cultures were not greedy and selfish and didn't breed like rabbits, and yet we've chosen to ignore that. The thing you have to understand, there's a picture of Mr. Malthus himself, the granddaddy of Malthusian theory, as it is locked in with modern demographic transition theory, which seems to be more modern, but is not actually any more scientific. In any case, he was a fundamentalist Christian. He blamed the poor for their poverty, just as Mr. Reagan did. They're on the right, and more charismatic modern conservatives continue to do. Laziness and poverty are cousins. Blame the poor for their poverty, blame them for breeding too much, in spite of the overwhelming influence of other cultural factors. The reality is that all pre-industrial cultures limited their population, and that empires seek growth. Empires are growth-oriented cultures, societies, and they are a relatively recent phenomenon. They seek growth of the working class so there can be more workers and more soldiers to increase the power of the ruling class. It really is that simple. That is what is driving this global population growth, is the growth of empire. Empire has spread all over the world. There was an aggressive campaign in terms of all of the colonialists all over the world to stop the population limiting behaviors of every pre-industrial population they ran into. At the point of a gun, they stopped these behaviors, and as a result, and brought in such ideology as was necessary to promote growth. And now we've got this monstrous growth machine, this kind of future cannibalism we've created, whereby we can eat the future for the benefit of our, for the benefit of those in power currently. It is a sad thing. So here we have a picture of the two Kung women. These are a hunter-gatherer group that lived in southern Africa, still live. Practiced hunting and gathering up until recently. I suppose some of them still do to some extent, although they have, as with all pre-industrial cultures, been highly impacted by modern industrial, imperial societies. They are, I don't think you can treat them as living fossils. We can't say they represent all of the hunter-gatherer history, but they are certainly an interesting insight into hunter-gatherer history. And remember, we, as human beings, we evolved as hunter-gatherers. So in terms of this notion that humans are innately greedy, let's see what the Kung have to say about that. To be stingy or far-hearted is to hoard one's goods jealously and secretively, guarding them like a hyena. The corrective for this, in the Kung view, is to make the hoarder give till it hurts. That is, to make him give generously and without stint till everyone can see that he is truly cleaned out. In order to ensure compliance with this cardinal rule, the Kung browbeat each other constantly to be more generous and not to hoard. But deplorable as they regard the fault of stinginess, the Kung's most scathing criticism are reserved for an even more serious shortcoming, the crime of arrogance. A stingy person is antisocial and irksome, but an arrogant person is actually dangerous because, according to the Kung, his pride will make him kill someone. Now that's Richard Lee's words, an anthropologist who studied these folks back in the 60s, mixed in with a few of the Kung's, their own words. So it is, I think, plausible and scientifically accurate to say that we evolved under conditions more representative by these statements than by the modern greedy acquisitive culture. Hunter-gatherer cultures had to be closer to the Kung view than they were to us. So this notion that we are greedy, that we have this greedy human nature, is just wrong. We are capable of greed or altruism, or of working in tight social groups. We're capable of all sorts of things. We make choices. It's not human nature. But we don't want to talk about empire. We don't want to talk about selfishness. We don't want to talk about this big geopolitical system that starves so many people and deprives so many people in the non-industrialized world, so that those of us in the industrialized world can live off of their wealth, live off the wealth of the world and not have to share it. So we call it human nature. What's the solution to all of this? It's the return to local economies, where local people will act in their own interest. They have to. Now you think localism, community, these are silly ideas of just a few fringe people. In fact, localism built the modern American economy. These are currencies. 6 different examples from the pre-Civil War era in the United States. What happened when the colonists moved westward, there wasn't enough currency to support the growing economy, so each bank in each little town with the westward expansion printed their own currency. It was enormously powerful. It built the modern industrial economy. So localism not only could be the basis of a new culture, a conscious culture, it can also be enormously economically powerful. The largest cooperative system in the world currently is called Mondragon. It's in Spain. It is a large, meaning thousands, tens of thousands of people involved in this. They run industrial concerns, all sorts of things that are not sustainable, but the idea that cooperatives are small, fringe, unimportant, not true. Even in the American economy to this day, there are a lot of cooperatives, productive cooperatives, electricity cooperatives, banking cooperatives, all sorts of cooperatives that kind of are just there under the glossy capitalist paint. One organization that promotes intentional living is called the Fellowship for Intentional Community. I've been involved with those folks a bunch. IC.org is their website. Eco-villages come in all shapes and sizes. People, we are not inherently acquisitive. We are not inherently greedy. We can build local economies where we provide more of our needs, where we create our own money, where we flip over currency, flip over value within our local community to support each other. It's being done all over the world. The reason we don't do it is because of throughput. Industrialism survives on throughput. So we have the big industrial factories that create wealth for their owners, that support a political elite, and that throughput supports the economy that allows us to build not only the military hardware, but also the financial systems, the insurance, banking, all of these systems we need, the imperial societies need to dominate the global economy. So that's our greed. It's not a personal human nature. It is a political structure that we have created that allows us to dominate, to move resources through our economy so we can dominate global systems. The alternative is local production that supports eco-villages, that supports democracy, that supports sustainability. Why aren't we all doing it already? Because we're sold out. Even those of us who want to claim we're so separate, we're still very bought into the mainstream systems. We have a fairly stark choice to make. This is a quote. It was originally, or has been in many places, and unfortunately this is an error in my book. I attributed this quote to Benito Mussolini, as many people have, when in fact there's no historical basis for that quote being attributed to Mr. Mussolini. It goes back a bit before him, but in any case, the quote is still interesting. Fascism should more appropriately be called corporatism because it is the merger of state and corporate power. Who knows who made that up, actually. But we are facing an enormous consolidation of corporate power. Exxon, Walmart, Amazon. We think we're living in a democracy. It's a very oligarchic society we live in at this point. Our food is owned by a few narrow corporations. The machines that pump the water, that allow us to live in our houses, all of these things are created by centralized corporations, and it does not bode well for democracy. We have to decentralize if we want to. But all of our academic, religious leaders, even the leftist leaders, one of the more stunning insights I came across was reading a biography of Karl Marx and realizing he got his PhD in philosophy before he started talking political economy. It was like, bang, light bulb, because I'd never been able to read Karl Marx. The dude talks in such traditional academic, circuitous, grandifying sort of ways. Wants to make himself look important. That's what he does. And, he was steeped in that academic tradition, and that is what allowed him to pretend to speak for the working class. Was the fact that he spoke in that academic language, which allowed a bunch of academics to kind of paste themselves over these popular uprisings of the last couple of centuries in particular, and pretend they were leading them, even though they weren't. They never were. These uprisings started. The uprisings that led ultimately to our modern form of democracy that had their roots in union organizing, to some extent communist and socialist organizing, but just workers and ordinary people getting together and demanding their rights. That's what has allowed democracy to grow. But we have this perpetual case of politicians, academics, even leftist academics, pretending to lead those movements, convincing everybody themselves that they have led those movements and created our movements, when in fact they have not. They always follow our movements. We have to create our own movements, but we have to syndicate them. This is the thing. We have this narcissistic view of of ourselves and of our political movements. It's like we're going to create a movement where everybody is the most important and can block a consensus process. That's not a social movement. It's not going anywhere. We have to get over the narcissism and band together in social movements, rebuilding economy and community from the ground up, and take back our democracy and our society. And that's what will address our ecological issues. We can't do it from the top down. So thank you very much for listening to Chapter 10, and have a good day.